You won't surrender, which means, surrender means only accept this moment as it is. But you won't be able to surrender unless you're completely fed up with suffering. You've had enough suffering. And at some level, you recognize that most of your suffering is self-created. It is created out of resistance to what is. It is created out of an interpretation of something that is. It comes from a thought, from an interpretation, not from the situation. So you realize really that I've had enough suffering, and only when you've truly had enough suffering in your life are you able to say, I don't need it anymore. Suffering is a wonderful teacher. Suffering is most people's only spiritual teacher. And suffering deepens you. It gradually erodes the mind-made sense of self, the ego. And for some people, the point arrives where they realize, I have suffered enough. And that, for example, is the case with almost all the people who come to a retreat. If you ask them, they've all had their share of human suffering. Otherwise they wouldn't be open to the message. They've had their share of human suffering, and they have reached a point where they are ready to listen to the message that says there is another way to live. There is another way in which you can live that does not create further suffering for yourself. Because to a large extent humans create their own suffering. And so when you are ready to hear that message, and that's really the message that is in every religion, that's the message, the central message of Buddhism is the end of suffering. And even the central message of the teaching of Jesus is finding the pearl of great price, finding the kingdom of heaven that is within you here and now, as Jesus says. And that, of course, is the end of living in a state of suffering. So one could say that you need suffering for you to realize, for you to come to a point of realization that you do not need to suffer anymore. There's a paradox here. If I had not suffered, this teaching would not exist. So you could say it has come partly as a result of intense suffering. Because as a human being I would not have evolved spiritually if I had not suffered. So suffering was my main teacher, and suffering is for many people their main teacher. But then some people are, when they are ready, they come into contact with a spiritual teaching or teacher, and that can speed up the process of realization that you don't need to suffer anymore. You're ready to hear that. So that was, the Buddha talked about nothing else already 2,600 years ago, that there can be an end to self-inflicted suffering. And when you don't inflict suffering on yourself anymore, and remember, it's the thoughts. Your thoughts make you suffer more than anything else. It's not usually the situation, it's your interpretation of the situation, of how dreadful it all is. And so when you see that, then you see there is another way to live in which I no longer mentally argue with what is. And that's the end of self-inflicted suffering. And if I no longer inflict suffering on myself, I no longer inflict suffering on others, because the two go together.
But what will make me or somebody else take that step? Is it just acceptance?
It's acceptance, but acceptance won't come unless you've reached this inner point of readiness. And this is why I never try to convince anybody that what I'm saying is true or they should practice something. I never say you should do this, or trying to convince somebody who doesn't want to believe it. That is pointless. Only if you are ready internally for it. And so one way of putting it is, say, if you have suffered enough, then you're ready, then you're open to it, and you immediately see the truth of it. You immediately see that you ultimately make yourself suffer. It's not the situation, it's the mental interpretation of the situation, which in most cases is a form of resistance. And that creates the suffering. And so you need to, when you hear these words, if you don't immediately recognize the truth, if there's an inner arguing, that's fine. There's no should here. There's no, the teaching never says this is how you should live. It's only if you can hear the truth of it, it will make sense to you, and then it can help you. So it can only help those who have an inner readiness. But there are many, many people alive now in whom the readiness is there. They are able to hear it, to truly hear it, and immediately recognize, yes, this is true. Convincing never works.
But being in the presence, I mean, is it a possibility for everybody?
It's being in the present moment is a possibility for those who are ready for it. Not yet for everybody.
What if we were all living in presence? I mean, what would happen? Would we have electricity and would it work?
One thing is certain, that the world would look very different from the way it is now. We can't possibly imagine how the human world would look if everybody lived in a different state of consciousness, in a state that is predominantly a state of inner peace. What kind of civilization would we create out of a state of inner peace? It's impossible to predict. All we can say is that probably it would not be as complex as it is now. People would not be running around continuously engaged in largely pointless activities. It would probably not be such a noisy civilization as it is now, because no civilization has ever been as noisy as this one, and that's simply because whatever human beings create externally is a reflection of their inner state. So we are polluting the planet simply because our inner selves are being polluted by an enormous amount of negativity, of continuous resistance. So the outer is always a reflection of the inner. So if the inner is predominantly a state of inner peace, we create a peaceful world on the outside. What exact form that would take, we don't know. We'd have to see what it is. It would very probably be a much more simple world, more harmonious and beautiful. Not nature is beautiful already, but I'm speaking of the human-made world.
Is it possible in a few words to say what is the essence of your teaching? Is that possible?
Well, the essence is very simple, and the essence could probably be taught, and perhaps one day will be taught to very young children at school. And children are very close to it anyway. The essence is, we could put it in the most simple terms, because the most simple is often the most powerful. The essence is to make the present moment into your friend, not your enemy. To always ask yourself, what is my relationship with the present moment? At this moment, of course. What is my inner relationship with the present moment? Is the present moment, am I friendly towards the present moment? Or am I hostile towards the present moment? Is the present moment my enemy? and then that would be enough to bring about a change, because when you realize that you are making the present moment into your enemy, and you also know that that's all you ever have in life, then you realize it is a mad way to live. To treat this moment as if it were an obstacle to where you want to get to. And you never get there because it's always now. Then your relationship towards the present moment changes. It changes, and your relationship becomes one of yes rather than no to what is. It does not mean that you become passive or that you will never do anything again. It simply means that the foundation for any action you take is the state of yes to what is. And if there's the inner state of yes to what is, that is the state of inner peace. And inner peace is much more powerful as a foundation for right action than the state of resistance and negativity. So that is the essence. Find that state of inner alignment with the present moment, which comes with a yes. And then see what happens. See how your world changes as you no longer resist the isness of this moment.
Thank you. It was what you concluded the teaching about your role as a teacher. And you said something about you have nothing to teach to nobody, something like that. Could you just state that, how you see your role as a teacher? In conventional terms, teaching means that I give you information that you didn't know. I add something to you. So a student absorbs new information, accumulates new information. But in spiritual teaching, the teacher just points to the truth that is already in every human being, and also points to the way in which that truth that is already in every human being is covered up. And anybody who is ready can immediately recognize the truth of the teaching as if they had already known it, because on some level they already knew it. And that's why I say I don't really have anything to teach in the sense of adding information to you. There's nothing that you need to add in order to find yourself and be yourself. You can add on an external level. It's nice to learn new things. It's nice to explore this or that. And yet on an essential level, the essential level is the level of who you are, your innermost sense of self. It's the level of being. On the most essential level, no matter where you are at in your life, what your life situation is, on the most essential level, nothing needs to be added to who you are. So the spiritual teaching is not a more, it's not an addition. It's simply a pointing towards that which is already there. And those who are ready then suddenly recognize the truth of it. Recognize means they already knew it. It's almost like remembering, yes. And then there's no question about, convincing is not necessary. It's immediate realization. Then the spiritual teaching works as it should. So that's how it operates, and that's the difference between a conventional teaching and spiritual teaching. In some sense, one could say the spiritual teaching is almost the opposite of the conventional teaching. If anything, it takes something away from you. It takes away that which covered up who you are. But it is not taken away by the teacher. It's taken away by yourself when you see it and become conscious of it. That's very clear. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Yes.